We've heard it over and over. Music's dead, streaming killed music culture, and genres don't mean anything anymore. But what if that's not a problem? Could this just be a natural evolution? Welcome to postmodernism, a time where we thrive by making up the rules. Or I guess more accurately, there are no rules. So, what is a genre? A collection of musical traits, maybe? Well, the amount of aesthetic traits shared throughout a diversity of microcultures sure does make that a less than ideal definition. Matter of fact, providing any definition is going to prove quite difficult, so let's use today's case studies to answer the burning question: what is genre? And how does understanding it help us create the new, the personal, and the exciting? Alright, time for a quick music history recap. Founder of the Newport Jazz Festival, George Wein, could not have possibly foreseen the consequences his silly little decision of including rock musicians like Jeff Beck, Jethro Tull, Sly, Led Zeppelin into his jazz show back in 1969 would have on music history as a whole. You see, old George just wanted to make a quick buck, but how was he rewarded for trying to expand his demographic to the younger crowd? Chaos. Pure chaos. Thousands of people rushed into Newport's unfortunate venue facilities, quickly overwhelming its maximum occupancy. So Wein swears never again to host bands of quite that status. So he calls the Allman Brothers, a relatively unknown band back in 1969. So he says, "I'm golden." He was not. Just a few months before the Summer Festival, now 1970, the Allman Brothers explode in popularity. And well, chaos ensues yet again. Wein then says, "Alright, I'll hire John McLaughlin, Jerry Goodman, Jan Hammer, all very respected by the jazz community, and have them perform that new style they've been cooking up as the Mahavishnu Orchestra." Perhaps he's found his Goldilocks middle. Jazz with electronics, though. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a different type of chaos. Here's why. If I now describe to you a genre of, say, heavily reliant on bassline, improvisation, groove, what did I just describe? Jazz? Gospel? Funk? If there's so much aesthetic overlap between genres, then there must be more to defining what they are. Well, as Professor Vivian Holt points out, genre is far more than music aesthetics. It's also a social collective, call it a culture. This is because people with shared aesthetic preferences also usually share things like geography and/or life experience. You see, aesthetic preferences usually stem from our personal history, our life world, if you will. So in a way, culture is when a group of people hold a creative mirror to their little piece of reality. For some, this aesthetic preference is an unexplainable magnetism to that which resonates with their being. To others, it's the image they learn to wear over time that is best rewarded by their social context. Of course, nowadays, with some notable exceptions, we have become far more casual when discussing musical taste, but back then, it was a serious matter of cultural identity. So that new chaos that our buddy George Wein let out of Pandora's box? Fusion. The way Tony Williams, Joni Mitchell, and Herbie Hancock joined McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra in playing with genres was seen by many as playing with fire. You see, jazz fusion was seen as an act of unwelcome transculturalism. But jazz has been known to borrow elements from other genres, you say? Well, the particular nerve Mahavishnu and subsequent fusionists struck was specifically mixing jazz with rock and funk. Well, elitism strikes again. But there's nothing time won't heal, right? Right? Well, thankfully fusionists kind of got their way, and the blurring of genre boundaries has continued to take over music. Today we have artists like Anomalie and Polyphia, the main topic of today's video. But even if to a lesser degree, it does seem like purists are here to stay. Only difference is now they come in all sorts of different flavors. We got the metal purists, the jungle purists, the UK garage purists, the list just goes on. All with their glass twirling, monocle wearing, superior gaze, and refined taste. They're all snobs. They do make one good point though. Look, taste has always felt like a pretty controversial topic to me. I'm not about to suggest the existence of some superior genre or aesthetic. It's just, I do feel like there are degrees to which we understand our own preferences. The so-called refined, unrefined taste, to me, really just comes down to how deeply we can perceive and understand the factors that make up an artistic cultural phenomenon. When talking about genre, for instance, how deeply can you perceive all the musical and extra musical factors that make up this genre? Remember, genre is also a cultural collective, right?
Blues is an allegory for the human condition in sound. It's a musical allegory that exists within the context of a cultural movement.
When I say musical factors, of course, I mean things like tempo, phrasing, harmonic choices, instrumentation, so on and so forth.
Blues is a form of music. It's also a form. It's a 12-bar form. It's a sound. It's a style. It's an inflection. You can sound like the blues without playing the blues.
And extra musical factors include but are not limited to things like fashion, speech, geography, and even interpersonal relationships.
There are dances, there are blues rituals, juke joints, stomps, boogie woogie, all this that we've grown accustomed to.
And okay, you don't necessarily need to be able to describe all these factors verbally, but because musical and extra musical factors do inform each other, you do need to be acquainted with them, especially if you're inspired by a culture that you don't belong to.
Now I can also implement that into other spaces of music, which becomes this democratic expression of humanity.
So in summary, taste is preference with context. Remember, in art, everything matters, and extra musical factors do in fact play a big role in how the music is perceived. It's in the details. They affect things like your articulation, your tone choices, your instrumentation. Extra musical factors always inevitably bleed into the musical ones. Trust me, the last thing you want to do as an artist is to end up appropriating the very thing that inspires you, so do your homework and do it well because people will be able to tell. Before the invention of photography, video, television, there existed a natural divide from culture and our everyday reality. You see, if you wanted to consume any art, you had to physically go to places like museums, concert halls, theaters, you name it. But today, the mass production of media, billboards, social media, TV, has caused culture to invade our very reality. But wait, if culture is, as we had discussed earlier, our representation of reality, isn't culture just inspiring itself now? The phenomenon of intertextuality, or culture-inspiring culture, has made it nearly impossible to maintain strict borders between artistic practices. We reference other people's work to such a high degree that sometimes we don't even know we're doing it. This isn't necessarily problematic, especially when it's done clearly and with good taste, but on the other hand, referencing foreign cultures in a cheap, meretricious way is strange at best, disrespectful at worst. Now, I'm not here to throw anybody under the bus. I'm just gonna say that there are artists who recently have received pretty harsh hatred and backlash for doing this very thing. And this usually looks like a combination of, again, poor interpretations of cultures that you don't belong to, as well as the cheap juxtaposition of aesthetic elements. It just doesn't work that way. Aesthetic elements usually need to be integrated with each other in some way. And well, what does that look like? Well, a positively received example of musical intertextuality comes in the form of Polyphia. With originally a metal upbringing, Polyphia started making headlines when guitarist Tim Henson started incorporating elements of hip-hop and trap into their music. I suspect one of the reasons this fusionary effort was so well received was because, again, rather than just imposing beats into their pre-existing music, they actually absorbed the aesthetics of hip-hop, EDM, and trap into their instrumental performances. You can hear it in drummer Clay Ashleman's almost drum machine use of hi-hat rolls, his unique minimalist approach to providing pulse, and his heavy use of embellishments. It almost makes his performance sound like very intricate MIDI programming, but like in a really musical way. And bassist Clay Gober complements this brilliantly by switching between the active bass lines that we would expect from such energetic music to an almost 808 sub feel, which is again super cool. Tim and Scott's neo guitar style could honestly be the topic of a full-on documentary, but the thing I find most mesmerizing is the way they use the full timbral range of their instrument in such rapid succession. It almost makes it sound like vocal chop editing, which I do know Tim has mentioned he was greatly inspired by that style at some point. But this MIDI, DAW, instrumental, intertextual relationship goes actually deeper with him, because he's mentioned that he's actually written guitar lines inspired by MIDI arpeggiators.
I was still having a bit of trouble making cool guitars, so I turned on the arpeggiator just to see how it sounded.
And And thanks to the Toadion, the Ibanez Tim Henson collaboration guitar, Polyphia has achieved new feats in modern fusion. And we saw with Playing God when they started incorporating flamenco elements into their music. And the way they do it, again, is so fascinating. Just like before, they embed these foreign elements so deep into their music that they don't feel foreign at all. And I think that's a pretty legitimate way of honoring the musical factors of a foreign classical genre like flamenco. Some examples, like for instance, their use of tremolos, and more specifically, how they use them so strategically to push the music forward. There's also the more dissonant chord extensions and the way they embed them into the sound world by using techniques like chordal planing, specifically chromatic chordal planing, which is, taking a chord and moving all of its notes up by half steps or down by half steps. And you might be asking yourself, what about the extra musical factors? Well, for instance, music and video today, just like in the MTV days, cannot be separate from one another. The only way to go big as a musician is to do music videos. And how do they dress in their music videos? Elegantly, like you would expect a flamenco artist to do. And again, these extra musical factors bleed into the musical ones. For instance, the way they taper their phrases so elegantly, the way they take time, the way they stick to the pulse, the way they do all sorts of different things. It's so well put together. Now, am I claiming that they did all of this on purpose? No, that would be an intentional fallacy. And when it comes to primary sources, all I have is that those lovely flamenco contributions were made by Wes Hauck from Alluvial. Super cool, nothing wrong with phoning a friend, right? And often artists at this level just operate by feel, because when you have such a well-developed sense of taste, you don't have to worry too much about citing your sources. Now, if by chance Tim's use of MIDI resources to inspire instrumental lines made you raise an eyebrow, you're gonna get a kick out of this one. Because we're all pretty used to the flow of ideas going the other way, no? Like with sampling, a practice that came about because of hip hop, where they would take pre-existing music, they would chop it up and do something completely different with it. Well, now we're going full circle as we have a new wave of musicians looking to sample-based music like lo-fi, hip hop, drum and bass, and out of that, they inspire their instrumental performances. This intertextuality stuff gets so meta. Early pioneer of this style, Anomalie, although still relatively underground, has helped enormously in the exploration of this new horizon. Like with Tim, he explores the relationship between MIDI and live performance. I'm actually pretty sure that they both use Ableton. I'm not certain that Anomalie produces in Ableton, but I do know that he uses the session view, for instance, to trigger loops and enable MIDI instruments, opening his solo keyboard act into a one-man orchestra of sorts. And this live performance practice was backed up by his awesome fusionary style. In an interview with Pan Am 360, he disclosed that his secret to amassing an audience with such an unorthodox style of music was actually, funny enough, to use very orthodox musical forms. He used pop forms. For those who don't know, form refers to the structure of a piece of music. In pop music, this usually looks like intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, bridge, outro, or some variation of that. And well, his improvisatory keyboard style backed up or embedded with pop music forms is yet again another beautiful example of embedded music aesthetics. So as for my personal takeaway, new genres don't come about through the layering or juxtaposition of sounds. I've noticed that usually good fusionists begin their musical journeys by mastering a pre-existing style, onto which they begin with time to embed the factors of foreign music aesthetics until they come up with something completely unique to them. As author of the book Birds of Fire, Kevin Fayes points out, this usually causes them to sit between genres rather than having a footing on several, because the mixture of aesthetic practices is usually never or should never be homogeneous. You can ask any type of artist, painter, chef, musician, doesn't matter, they'll tell you, evenness is dull. So the public success of an innovative style usually depends on the boldness an artist develops by becoming confident in their taste. And you can usually see a pretty awkward adolescence in their discography, but the ones that push through find something awesome on the other side.